We are calling this special session of the Board of Trustees study session on June the 19th, 2020 at 5:11 p.m. Please join us in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Dr. Garcia, is this the time that you're going to open it up to the public to make comments, or is that going to be at the end of it?
No, I would like to open it up at the beginning.
Thank you, sir.
And once again, this will be the only opportunity for our visitors to comment. You can use the hand raise function to get our attention. So please, if you don't know how to use the hand raise function, check the participants icon, what should, for most of you, be at the bottom of your screen. And in that participant bank, you'll be able to gesture there if you'd like to make a comment.
And how do you make a comment if you're on the phone?
I would unmute. Oh, good point.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Pound 6.
Oh, and it looks like we lost all of our phone guests, actually.
The hand raise function is not showing on my screen, so I'm raising my hand.
Okay. All right. Thank you, sir. Go ahead, Mr. Van Meter.
Yes, thank you. For those of us who've not been paying attention, I want to first say that the remarkable participation of so many people in the community leading to this whole consolidation effort has just been remarkable. And I saw the number of meetings, et cetera, that have taken place, and I congratulate them on their diligence. But coming in late in the game, I looked at the heat map that I guess we'll be discussing tonight. And I think in your future deliberations for the late arrival public like myself, it would be helpful to know why a 100% charter-only school is not listed as one of the options that's being considered at this point. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Van Meter. We definitely will be speaking to that topic tonight. And thank you for that question. And that, I'm sure that will be a continued discussion as we have other joint study sessions of the joint boards and of this board. But hopefully we'll answer that question for you this evening. Any other intent to comment from the public? Seeing none, I will proceed. And that is your opportunity for public comment. Thank you for joining us tonight. We will begin by looking backwards, looking at where we've been. I know many of all of you as board members have attended different events related to desegregation and unification. But I wanted to begin tonight by reminding us where we started and how long ago it was. We're living in a very different world than when we originally started working on this. Way back in July of 2019, we started this work. And we made a unification committee. It was my first 2 weeks on the job. And we never could have imagined a world where there would be no power for days on end, even though there was nothing wrong with the power lines, or a world where schools had to close for days because of that. Nor could we imagine global pandemic and what it would mean to shut schools in that regard, or sweeping civil activity and social change movements occurring in the middle of that shelter in place. But I wanted to ground us tonight and remind us that we embarked upon this journey in July for many of the same reasons that the world is reflecting on much more deeply today. We were reflecting on that here as a micro community back in July, and our goal was to engage all community stakeholders in a feedback and input process and identify priorities and pathways to the unification of Willow Creek and Bayside MLK into a single school, to build consensus around the best pathway forward, and to generate a final report to the Board of Trustees, exploring possible options for a single school solution, including consideration of the advantages, disadvantages, issues, concerns, and feasibility of same. And that we would actively seek input and participation from parents and guardians, staff, community, and students, and consult with other local public boards and agencies, outlining the potential options for a single school, along with any related findings, proposals, recommendations, or considerations. And I'm actually proud of the journey that we've been on as a community and as an organization and as a board. And we have done a lot of what we set out in this goal. We haven't quite accomplished it fully yet, but we are, much like the world is different due to COVID-19, we are in a much different place in our journey towards unification than we were in the second week of July of 2019. And so this is just a gentle reminder of all of the events that took place from July to September. 10 different meetings, 14 different meetings through October. And then we started our work group process. And wow, did those work groups put in a lot of work. At minimum, people met 4 times, I think was the lowest number of meetings I saw of any work group. Each of those meetings were for 2 hours. Many of our work groups met literally a dozen times, 17 times, 20 times. People put a tremendous amount of time and energy into this effort from our community. And everything that you see laid out before you is informed by that work and by those recommendations. And I want to just invite everyone to take a moment and appreciate all of the other people that are not here with us tonight, but whose voices are here in these recommendations, whose time and energy and spirit and mind and innovation went into getting us to where we are. We met and we had 2 more town halls. And it wasn't until mid-December of 2019 that we actually got off this timeline. Only in mid-December did we decide, hey, we might need some more time. And that time was extended again. Not only were there a lot of public-facing meetings that many of you attended, but there was a lot of other meetings as well. There were single unification committee meetings of just Trustee Turner and just Trustee Van Alst. There were meetings all through the spring. We have met 22 times as a unification task force. We didn't even rename ourselves that until January. Each of those meetings is about 2 hours long. So for those of you that haven't been active participants in the process up until now, I just want to invite you to consider that nothing being discussed here tonight has been decided, but everything that's being discussed here tonight has had a lot of reflection and a lot of time and a lot of energy put into what's coming before you tonight by dozens and dozens of community members and staff and board members. Oh, sorry, I clicked on the wrong document there. We've been meeting twice a week for the past 3 weeks.
Wow.
And so I just wanted to spend a moment looking back at how we got here to this meeting. And thank you everyone for making a couple hours on Friday, late Friday evening on Juneteenth. And I hope we all go out and celebrate afterwards, because we're going to finish on time today.
Today.
And
a blank screen.
And I hope many of you may have celebrated some already today.
What is on time?
Oh, this meeting is scheduled from 5 to 7, sir.
Okay, thank you.
And so to that end, I want to stop looking backward and really dig into the reason why we're here tonight. But I want to thank all of you for the time and the energy and the attention that you are putting here tonight, because it is in line and in spirit with everything that has happened in unification and all of the recommendations that are here before you. So we'll move to item 3.02 and stop looking backwards. And the reason there is no backup here is that it's a simple concept. The idea is that as the Unification Task Force began to turn the corner and really get to out of a discussion phase and towards a phase where we could start really putting a plan on paper that we could bring to the community to get more feedback on. And make no mistake, this is what that is. This is simply the first round of transparent, open meetings. What we felt a duty to do is that three of our board members are not on the task force. And so we felt a duty to get our full board up to speed before we moved forward. But there will be a joint meeting between the Willow Creek board and our board, a study session similar to this one. Let me rephrase that. It's not a meeting, it's a study session. And we will go back to the unification work groups once we have feedback from both boards, and get another round of feedback from them before we even consider finalizing any recommendations. And then we'll get a round of feedback from the community, and we'll have one last town hall. It might be on Zoom. Maybe it'll be in person. I think if we do it well, it'll be on Zoom, because it'll be sooner rather than later. But those are the next steps we're going to take in terms of community engagement and decision-making on any aspect of this plan. And so I want to assure anyone here today or anybody who watches this recording that anything having to do with this plan moving forward will be very transparent and open. And so we discussed, as a unification task force, 3 implementation dates of when to unify. And those 3 dates that the unification task force has been focused on are fall of 2021, namely August or September of 2021, January of 2021, and August or September 2020, i.e. about 10 weeks from now.
Yeah.
And some of you may wonder, well, why would you try to plan to open this fall? There's a lot of work still left to do, and that seems really soon. And you'd probably be right about that. I've certainly sat in many unification meetings and suggested that we take our time and that we not throw our 2 school communities together quickly.
Excuse me, Dr. Garcia. I've just been told that there are people in the waiting room.
Thank you. Sorry to keep you waiting, Barb and Lexi and Khan. I will keep my participant window open and keep an eye. My apologies, our district admin assist who usually drives these meetings so that I can talk without having to pay attention to the side panel. It was unable to join us this evening due to his family circumstances that we shared last night.
Yes.
And so I ask your grace and patience for.
Well, can any of us see that? Deborah, did someone tell you? Or
No, someone texted me that they were waiting to get in.
yeah, okay. So if we can see it, we'll let you know, but
Thank you.
totally understandable.
And so I was saying, why would we try to unify as early as September? And the main reason for us bringing before you a plan tonight that focuses on unification as early as September and doesn't focus on the other two dates that I shared, January 2021 or fall of 2021, is that as we began to really get into the detail phase of planning, we felt as a unification task force that under these incredible circumstances of COVID-19 and all of the ways that school's going to change in the fall, no matter what we do, that this was a good opportunity to unify, and perhaps the only opportunity that allows school to fully open for all students in the 94965 in the fall, where any child and family that wants to have the opportunity to physically come to school can come to school. And so that is why we are focused on our plan 9/2020 and are not bringing before you alternatives of January 2021 or fall of 2021. What we have built some consensus around as a unification task force is if we can't get this done in a time frame for the fall, then we will shoot for the next closest date. But I wanted, before we dig into the plan, for everyone to really understand our rationale for focusing in November. We believe the limitations that operating under COVID-19 safely puts forward, that unification is the best option to open school for all students. I want to pause there for board comment.
Yeah, I just wanted to add quickly who the committee members were. I'm not sure if all of you, our board members, remember, but we had Lexi and Johanna and Elena from the Willow Creek board. Early on, Marika joined, but then I think she realized she was better served on a facilities work group. And Lexi kind of joined us about midstream, but Elena and Johanna have been a part of it practically from the beginning. And through that process, it was a fabulous open discussion between all of us about a lot of the difficulties, a lot of the concerns, and there was a bit of a struggle, I think, in the beginning to get on the same page, but as we worked together, and as I think a lot of work groups experienced the same thing, as we were working together and finding consensus on pros and cons of the different options, we started becoming I think a really great cohesive functioning task force in examining all the issues. And while we didn't always agree, I think we fully vetted these options and the pros and cons, and we'll go through some of those with you tonight as we went through the different iterations and options and qualities of an educational program that we'd need to consider for unification.
I want to say that this has been a pretty remarkable experience for me. because as some of you may know, my pre-trustee role in the district as a board meeting attendee, given that that's where I started, and where I am today as someone who believes deeply in unification and who also has discovered quite personally that working side by side is the way to build trust, really working together to serve all the kids in our district is really it's a wonderful transformative experience. And I just will say that I think Caroline and I have begun to have more than begun, are real colleagues. We really both want what's best for all the kids, and we really both have supported that in each other. And while I know that's not the hard facts that we're here to gather and vet, it's really the heart of the matter. And when we find that we can work together, we find trust is grows, and that's really what unification will fully depend on. And I think just to underscore what Dr. Garcia said, I didn't say this, but out of one of our more recent unification task force meetings, it was said that we hope we can do this for our children in the fall. That's it, because that's how we will best serve all our children in the fall.
I think timing is so very interesting in all of our lives, quite frankly. You all put a lot of your investment into these discussions and, meeting twice a week and on. And you have your lives, you have families, some of you have children, you have spouses. It's so much wrapped around. And as Dr. Garcia echoed, that we don't want to do anything quickly. I don't feel that at this crossroads that is a case for me, because you put in all the back work. If a fall open was to happen, I think we would be shockingly surprised if the doors open and kids just come pouring in. Possibly, families would take advantage of that, but overarching, obviously you have a plan in place for that as well, if it is to happen for fall. But I don't know, I just think it's the right time to have this conversation in our nation, quite frankly. We've been kicking the can down the road, as you will, for too long. And people are not remiss in the 94965 of all the contentious feelings behind our two school districts. They're not. I know that the result of Bayside Martin Luther King being on one campus, to me, was a rushed decision. And at the time, perhaps it was the best one for the district. I don't know. I've said many times, I am a product of this district in a one school district. There was never these two schools within the district. So I'm so happy that you've had many meetings with lots of parents and lots of community folks and on and on. And that the discussion doesn't end. There's still more talking to be had. So
I just want to add one more thing, is that I viewed my participation in this group as a fact-finding mission, just looking at the pros and cons and options. And we'll go through the heat map in a minute. Some of these colors are just based on what the 6 of us could come up with as a group. But that's why it's being brought forward to the board and then to the joint boards and the public, because maybe there's some things that weren't considered. So this is just where we are at this point. And kind of the options that we've viewed. Maybe there's some other configurations that weren't considered, but this is kind of the big reveal of our, back of our work, kind of the fact-finding mission. And, I think there's some that had a concern that the meetings should have been open and lacked transparency. I see that concern. I understand it. At the same time, as kind of a committee that was dealing with a lot of very sensitive topics and issues, it was helpful to be able to be open and candid and put a lot of the elephants in the room on the table to really get down to the heart of issues. And I think it was not intentional to keep these, not open and not public, but I think it was beneficial for the process that was intended. And it was always intended that the work from this group would be put out to the public to then carry forward.
So you're talking about the task force meeting?
Yeah, the task force, right. Yeah, and the task force is a combination of our board's unification committee and Willow Creek's board's unification committee. And they were formed separately, if you recall, but then both our boards and our committees decided it'd be better if we worked together than apart. And that's how this group was formed.
Thank you.
Thank you, Caroline. Trustee Huff, Trustee Barrow, do you want to comment?
Without getting into the plan, it's hard to talk about timeline, so I think I'll reserve my comments until we get a little deeper.
Yeah. And I will just say I certainly appreciate it being involved in the work groups, and I have had the opportunity to participate in the Willow Creek, or watch the Willow Creek unification study session. So that was helpful for me. So, thanks.
Yeah, I just want to reiterate some of the things that both Caroline and Deborah expressed. We are very excited and feel very positive about our collaboration with Alina and Johanna and Lexi. What you have here before you in the discussion we're going to have tonight and that we're going to keep having is something that our whole group is feeling very positive about, the way that we're working together, the direction that we're going. And I just wanted to reiterate that. I know it was said before, but I feel a tremendous amount of hope for the future, of hope for our community, of hope for all of our students and all of our families, and hope for just the truly world-class school system that Sausalito and Marin City deserve. I think we're knocking on the door, and I want to invite all of you to step through with us.
Yeah.
So I think it is useful, before going any further with this heat map, to think about how we arrived at the colors. And when I say we, I want to be very clear. This heat map was just developed by the Sausalito Marin City Unification Committee. We will develop a heat map like this with the full task force prior to the joint study session. And that being said, this heat map tracks very closely all of the conversations and all of our meetings and all of our other consensus building that we've gone through. But where you see a green color, think ease of process and fiscal viability. Where you see a yellow color, think it might be an easier process, but it might be risky financially, or it might be a difficult process, but it might also be fiscally viable. And that's the thinking behind the yellow gradient. The red gradient means that it's complicated and challenging and difficult and fiscally risky. Caroline, Deborah, do you want to add anything about this conversation?
No, I think you hit it. And just to clarify, easy isn't necessarily easy. It's just the shortest word we could fit on the key. So I don't want anyone to think any of this has been easy. Will be easy. Yeah.
Easier.
Easier, correct. That's right.
Perhaps it should have said less complex.
Yeah, that's too many words.
Yeah, right.
I got my caveat in there.
So what we tried to do is lay this heat map out in terms of what was considered, and then why it was graded that way. And then you'll see only two of these bullets here will have a texture, and the texture there just signifies that we graded it the way we graded it, but there's still potentially an unknown variable there, and we can discuss that when we get to it. We started actually, it was interesting. The only question that we got from the public before we started was from Mr. Van Meter, and he asked why an independent charter hadn't been considered. And we did. Boy, did we spend a lot of time considering the different types of organizational structure. I think we must have spent 2 or 3 meetings even trying to define the word structure.
Mm-hmm.
What was an organizational structure? What was a facilities structure? What was a governance structure?
Staffing structure.
What was a staffing structure, right? Because we kept hearing this word structure, and then we realized people were using the word in different ways. And so what I want to spend a moment on before we go further is really the types of organizational structure that were considered. And all organizational structures were considered that we know of, that we thought were available to us, or that came up in unification town halls, or that were suggested by both boards. And basically those are 4 structures. An independent charter structure, as was asked by Mr. Van Meter, meaning that there's one single independent charter school. Also, a hybrid structure was considered, part traditional, part independent charter, part traditional, part dependent charter. And you'll see in just a moment as we get deeper into this conversation why we ended up with 3 main foci, which were that hybrid option and then an all dependent charter option. And the 4th option that we considered is an all traditional model. Both schools becoming 2 traditional schools of the Sausalito Marin City School District, as has been the case for most of the district's history. And so, Trustee Van Ost, Trustee Turner, do you all want to start, since the question came from the public, at independent charter?
Sure. And I just want to add, though, before we move on to that we spent, I would think, the majority of our time kind of focused on hybrid, and under a certain assumption, and we'll talk about that in a minute, but then we found that assumption was not as important as we thought it might be. So, certainly our focus on these and input from others, particularly like the Willow Creek study sessions, informed this process. So it wasn't just our group. We got information from attorneys, we had information from other study sessions, from conversations with folks. So there was a lot of input that went into these. So independent charter, we had one attorney or several attorney memos that came from our attorney, and then Willow Creek's attorney, also provided a memo. And then we had a third kind of neutral attorney provide a memo and some talking points. And a lot of that was to inform some of the legal opinions behind the pros and cons and the requirements for each of these structure options. And it was considering, a lot of the information that's across the top, governance structure, funding, unions, and enrollment options. What else? Those were kind of the main ones. And so while we were talking about the different structures, traditional, dependent charter, hybrid, independent charter, I think we were initially focused on information from those memos and what were some of the impacts from Ed Code and on both the governance, finances, oversight, and so forth. And for the independent charter, I guess we just go through each of the columns. We haven't rehearsed this clearly, but I'll just go through each of the columns. Is that?
Yeah, that sounds good.
Okay. So I'll just jump to inter-district transfer agreements. So if we have both a dependent charter and independent charter, and a student comes to our district and says, we don't want to attend your charter school, you have to provide a traditional school option. And the way all charter districts have done that, in my understanding, is that you obtain an inter-district transfer agreement. It doesn't have to be a contingent district. It can be a contiguous district. It can be, San Rafael. It could be Mill Valley. It could be Ross, Tiburon, wherever. But you need to have an alternative for that student who does not want to attend the charter. And again, that's independent versus dependent. And just to back up, independent and dependent really is kind of not really nomenclature that's used in industry. It's just kind of where people have landed on describing these two different structures. Independent means the funding essentially is, it's a separate entity, and the funding, it doesn't come directly from the district. There's also direct funding that comes from the state and the federal and so forth. Whereas dependent charter, it's funded directly by the district, and it's on the district's books and so forth. So an independent charter has its own books, like Willow Creek is an independent charter. A dependent charter would be under our books, under our governance, and so forth. So that's kind of the difference. But both charters would require an inter-district transfer agreement. And we have those as red because that's viewed as sometimes difficult to get, to have a K-8 inter-district transfer agreement with another district. There's also concerns that, let's say we had it with Mill Valley, and it could be, there could be a loss of enrollment of families who decide to take advantage of that inter-district transfer agreement with Mill Valley versus staying within our district and the charter. So we could have kind of a de facto exodus of families through this agreement. I don't think Mill Valley would be too happy about that either. But that was something we considered in that process. Any questions about that part so far? No. And then governance, as we know, the independent charter has its own board, whereas a dependent charter would be governed by the district board. But both of those under a all charter district, which is the same for dependent charter and independent charter. All charter districts, and correct me if I'm wrong, need to be approved by the county and the state. But they would be overseen by our board.
Except in the case of an all independent charter district.
Be overseen by the state, that's right.
And
the county.
And administered by the county Board of Education and the county superintendent.
Okay.
Oh, thank you for answering that, because I was thinking in my head, how do you have an independent charter in the district? How does a district float just an independent charter for all of its?
Yeah. So I want to correct my answer, my what I said there. An independent charter would need to be approved by the state and the county, and the oversight would be the county of an all independent charter district. So that's red for the independent charter under governance, because that would be giving up local control. And I know there's some folks that may not want the county to have oversight. Sorry, Tarina, I know you're on the call.
No apology needed. The county doesn't want it either.
Okay. And so that's why that's red. And dependent charter, it's yellow because we would still maintain some local control with the governing board being the oversight body of the dependent charter. So some people view that, you know, there's some trust issues with the board, and I'll just put that out there. But that's why that's yellow, because it would be essentially giving up a independent board that Willow Creek currently has with an independent charter, and it would be go to governance from the district board. Does that make sense to everyone?
I don't follow how an independent charter gives up local control if you still have a local board overseeing the charter. I do follow why it still may be marked red, but perhaps for other reasons.
Yeah, my understanding from our council that that's the function of being a separate entity, and not under essentially the district's books and records, and as a public school entity within the district. Dr. Garcia, any clarification on that for Tarina?
Yeah. While you would still have an independent board, and in that sense, that would be correct. The authorization of the charter school and the administration of the charter school would be under the county board and the county SUP. I think the other thing that makes this governance structure red is the county and the county board would then decide upon the allocation of resources. And so there's a chance that you lose control of your basic aid funds under that scenario, because the county board and the county superintendent administrate that. And I think when Trustee Van Alst is referring to a loss of local control, that's more so what she means.
So it wouldn't automatically be entitled to all the basic aid?
No, it would be entitled to the LCFF formula.
Got it.
Yep. And then independent charter on in-district and out-of-district enrollment, and it's the same as dependent charter. My understanding is that, and we know from the way Willow Creek operates, that a charter school in California, if there's room in the classrooms enrollment cap, that you would need to accept any student within the district or within California that applies to the school. So Willow Creek has both in-district and out-of-district enrollment. And if we're the only, if the dependent charter and the independent charter are the only schools in the district, the concern was that that may limit in-district enrollment. So if you had an in-district student come mid-year, that and there wasn't room in that classroom, while there's certain things you could try and do, increase class size, move a student between grades. It's a lot of kind of machinations in order to enroll that in-district student. And so if we're trying to provide kind of unlimited access for in-district enrollment, then traditional was really the best option for that. And that's why dependent charter, independent charter got yellow under in-district enrollment. Hybrid, just to clarify, that is a combination of either traditional and dependent charter, and it's just a mix of maybe traditional for 6th through 8th grades and dependent charter for K through 5. So hybrid just means that it's a mix of the two structural options within the K-8 model. And then out of district enrollment, they're yellow because for dependent charter and independent charter, the district doesn't get additional funding for basic aid students that enroll in our district. We do get it for LCFF, but we don't get that for basic aid. Although I think that just changed for if it was an independent charter authorized by the state or the county. I think that law just changed where that school would get basic aid money. In addition to students that come from LCFF districts. So that
in our board meeting, yeah.
So this is a fluid model. Things are changing day to day. So as we're looking through independent charter, there were a couple of areas that made it seem not the most viable option. And then as Dr. Garcia referred, it was a long discussion between the interdistrict transfer agreements, the oversight of the county board, the potential loss of funding, the in-district and out-of-district enrollment issues. And then there's also this indemnification topic where, if I get this right, a public school essentially is protected under Ed Code from lawsuits from third parties for their teachers and staff and so forth. Under Ed Code and under public law, whereas dependent and independent charters don't. My understanding is they aren't granted that same indemnification. So there's a level of risk that our district would take on if we became an all independent or all dependent district. Did I describe that right?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm kind of going through the whole chart here when we meant to just talk about independent charter, but it's hard to just isolate that and not do a compare and contrast.
Right.
I think the only thing that you haven't touched is, at least with respect to the independent charter, is the issue of unions.
Right. Yeah, and the unions are green in all, mostly because I think there's a misconception that charters can't be union, but they can. So you could have union members in all 4 options. And while we had a long discussion about union versus non-union, really came down to the reality that we have an existing union in our district. And in order to go non-union, the union members would need to have a 51% vote to decertify. And the chances of that are, I would assume, highly unlikely. Yeah. And then at the same time, there's benefits to the union with, we found out that the salary schedules are not that different between Willow Creek and the district. There's just increased benefits between health and welfare, vision, dental, and the pension benefits. So, and, that said, folks who are concerned about unions and the environment, just want to remind everybody that Mill Valley, Ross, Tiburon, Belvedere, pretty much all of our neighboring districts have unions, and they're highly functioning districts. And my understanding is your relationship with the union, I think, has a lot to do with your superintendent in place at the moment. And I see Tarina and Dr. Garcia shaking their heads because both of you, I think, have developed a fabulous relationship with our unions, and have strengthened our schools, I think, because of that. So any questions about that?
Indemnification, wouldn't hybrid still at least be partially yellow?
You're right.
Okay.
Yeah.
What was the question? I'm sorry. it cut off.
Yeah, hybrid probably should be yellow because
Yeah.
it's kind of in between the two. So good point, Josh.
Got it.
Yeah.
Yeah, it would be partially.
Yeah.
Have yellow stripes.
Yeah.
No.
No. We're trying to avoid all the different, graph, And so I kind of went through all of this traditional ease of in-district enrollment. You can still enroll out of district, but there's not a mandatory requirement. It's set by the board. And while we do allow for out of district enrollment within Bayside MLK, it's not. And because we're a basic aid community funded district, when we get out of district students in a traditional school, they don't typically come with additional funding. That said, we are a school of choice. And so we would still get 25% of the LCFF amount for students coming from LCFF districts. But when we typically enroll additional students, we don't get more money under a traditional model. Inter-district transfer agreements, we wouldn't need one. Governance, it's yellow because of the trust factor with the board. And indemnification is green, union's green. So.
Are there any discussions of factors beyond these 6 in comparing and contrasting these?
There's some more on the next
second
slide.
page, another page.
Yeah.
We want to just make sure that there's time for all the trustees to ask about these issues and this configuration. I think maybe I'd like to add, Caroline, if it's okay. We spent a lot of time focused on a hybrid option. Months.
Yeah.
That's the truth.
Focused on a hybrid option.
Right.
And we were actually convinced for a long period of time that that was our best option.
And we were looking at traditional middle school and dependent charter elementary school as perhaps an ideal configuration, but there was no decision. It was just, an option out there for hybrid. But go ahead. I cut you off, Dr. Garcia.
No, that's okay. I just kind of wanted to narrow the field on the one hand and explain the process, because it was not until very recently that we began to focus on the traditional option.
Can I say why?
Why not?
The reason we felt that there would be a strong attachment to a charter school being offered to the Willow Creek community, that was of primary concern to most of the Willow Creek community. And
I'm sorry. Does it have something to do with traditional schools in general? The stigma of a traditional school.
No,
I think it had to do It had to do in part with a misconception that project learning can only happen in a charter school. That there's a kind of flexibility that's only available in a charter school. So later in our heat map, we'll get to some of those issues. But and we also felt that it was just there was an emotional attachment to a charter school.
Right. Yeah, and so we were respecting that, and that's why we were all thinking that a hybrid model would be a way to retain families. The word charter would stay within the construct of the structure of the school, and that the 6 of us thought it might be important to the community. But then when it was brought to the Willow Creek study session, and which I attended one, listened to the other, I think the idea was, as long as there's educational or curriculum flexibility that charter schools can mostly experience, and that does not go away in a traditional school, that it's still an option in a traditional school, then I think the sentiment of at least some of the board members was in that study session was they were not as attached to charter. That if educational flexibility and curriculum flexibility, project-based learning is all still available in a traditional model, then that seemed to be okay.
So Dr. Garcia, can you speak to that? Because that there is that overarching, mentality that because you're a traditional school and there you have some guidelines that you have to follow with the federal and the state government. Like they tell you what your curriculum is going to be, and they tell you how your school day is going to look like, and they tell you. And I'm just, I don't know. Has it ever been like that?
Well, interestingly, all of the things that you just mentioned, both independent and dependent charter schools have to be in compliance within the state of California anyway. And so maybe what's a more a frame that's more helpful in understanding is what the rights of independent and dependent charter schools are in comparison and contrast to a traditional school district. So independent charter schools have the right to use an alternative accounting formula from the rest of the schools in the state of California. They don't have to use SACs. They can use SACs, but they can use an alternative, not formula, but alternative accounting methodology. And until 2025, independent charter schools can hire non-credentialed teachers. After the 24-25 school year, independent charter schools will no longer have that right in the state of California. Law was changed January of 2019. But when they were originally founded, that was supposed to be an indefinite aspect of independent charter schools. And they have an independent board. And they are independent legal entities. And that's why they're called independent charters. But other than that, most of their compliance requirements, all of their compliance requirements outside of the things that I just named, and some of the things that we've discussed about interdistrict transfers and LCFF funding, are pretty consistent with the rest of the schools in the state of California. You have to follow instructional minutes. You have a slightly lowered instructional day calendar. Charter schools were able to do 175 days. Traditional schools have to do 180. But the instructional minutes requirement is there for both independent and dependent charters. And so those are the real differences in that regard.
Thank you.
Yeah, and it was helpful having Johanna on our committee. She's a retired superintendent from a very large district, or several districts from her past. And she has had dependent charters in her district. And so she provided some great perspectives, kind of from a real world experience of dependent charters and traditionals. And she felt, if we still wanted to go a dependent charter route, it's a little bit complicated, but it's not, impossible, and it was workable for her district. And they did tend to have sometimes unique curriculum, but that was because they had a lot of traditional schools and they were a larger district. And so the charter school would kind of branch out and do some kind of unique program within that district. Whereas we're one small district, we would have one school. And so the modeling and traditional school would have immense amounts of flexibility in the programming. Charter schools and traditional schools, as I understand it, still have to comply with Common Core. You still do the state testing. You still have to have certificated teachers. At least for a couple of years, charter schools don't need certificated specialists, but that's going to end in a couple of years. So I think a lot of that provided some comfort that there is educational flexibility in traditional schools. And I was reminded one topic about governance and the the board trust issue. Independent charter, they have their own board. They're appointed members from the community, often parents of the community. So there's some advantages to the governing board. And they have different levels of expertise and experience and backgrounds that they bring to an independent board. Under an elected governance structure, you're essentially, you can ask someone to run, but you're limited to who wins in the election. And so you can't guarantee you're going to get certain levels of experience, expertise, or backgrounds on the governing board. But that said, we were talking about having an advisory group that would be advisory to the governing board, and that would be under traditional dependent charter and hybrid models. And that advisory group could be comprised of, a variety of folks from the community, from perhaps even the former Willow Creek board, if that's the direction we would go. Perhaps representatives from the work groups. And then there was a concern about whether that advisory board would, for lack of a better term, have teeth, be listened to or have some ability to not just be, cast aside. So one idea was to put one or two members of that advisory board, invite them as guests up at the dais. So while they wouldn't be voting members of our board, they could participate in discussions freely and wouldn't be limited to the 3-minute conversations. And one that, so that was an option that I think the group had put forward.
Thank you for saying that, because as you were talking, I was thinking to myself, even though you have an elected body that's in your school district, and for an independent charter school that appoints their board, that there's always space, always has been space, I believe, to have configuration or whatever, however you want to say it, of an advisory board to the district. Folks should know, if you tuned into our board meeting on last night, we were on that meeting for over 7 hours. There's enough work to go around for many people. So to have that component of an advisory board that's a great idea. As you were talking, Caroline, I was like, well, did you, there's always room to have, more people at the table. I think they call themselves volunteers too.
Yeah. And if we had one or two, I don't know how you all feel about one or two guests at the dais. I've done that at Willow Creek board members at board meetings when I was the liaison, and they would invite me to sit at the table with the board members. And while I wasn't a voting member, I found it greatly facilitated my conversations with the board members and my ability to provide input when they were discussing different board topics. I'm not sure who would volunteer for our board, considering we have 7-hour meetings until 12:30 at night. But I think that would provide perhaps a level of assurance and help garner some trust with the community that members of the community would have active participation.
Yeah, and you know what, Caroline, that word trust, that word just keeps kind of regurgitating itself. I would hope that folks at this juncture would see that trust is happening. Trust is, having these conversations. Trust is bringing people together. What is, I keep hearing this word trust. But short of Bonnie, tuning into the Willow Creek board meetings, or, one of us should have, I think our board at any point should be at the table for the independent charter. I believe that's a part of our oversight. I don't know if we've ever exercised that or not.
No, they've invited us to do it several times. We've just never decided to do it. They've invited us many times to do that.
Are there meetings as long as ours? Because I
I don't think so, but
I apologize.
yeah.
They're
Let me
meetings
just-
are shorter, but they have more of them.
Yeah. Well, and trust comes up a lot because it comes up a lot, you know.
I
Our
want to
district-
just say that I think this governance thing is great, and I know that it deserves a lot of conversation. And I just want to point out that we have 45 minutes, and I hope that we'll just stay moving, not go down too deep into weeds, because our purpose of this meeting is to let you know about the process we've gone through in our 28, meetings or 21 meetings. So
that we've summarized in 2 pretty charts.
yeah, right.
The other thing I want to offer, just for consideration, and then maybe given your prompt, Deborah, we can move to the next slide and get into some of the next categories, because I don't hear a lot of questions from trustees about what has been presented so far. But I did want to say a word about the amount of time we spent on looking at a hybrid model and the turn towards a more traditional model, if that's all right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What we learned as feedback from the Willow Creek board study session was that there was perhaps less of an attachment to the idea of remaining a charter than we had assumed when we had spent so much time working together. But beyond that, I think the main reason that we have made a pivot towards an all traditional model is that in terms of a timetable, in terms of what's accomplishable in a short amount of time, it is the most accomplishable model. If we're going to go hybrid or we're going to go dependent charter, the process to do that is longer and is more complex. While we have the union button green, because under both of those models you can have a union, the process to get there is more complex. The current union members that are working in traditional schools would have to vote to become a dependent charter or have certain grade levels become dependent charters. No such vote is necessary for both schools to become traditional. In order for us to operate a hybrid model or to be an all-dependent charter district, Willow Creek would have to surrender its current charter and re-charter as a dependent charter school, or re-charter as a dependent charter school that covered those grade spans. All of those processes take time. And as we said at the outset, our goal is to have a brick and mortar offering for every student in the 94965 in the fall. And the way to do that in the next 10 weeks is easiest and most expeditious under a traditional model. Yeah. Under that model, Willow Creek, given many decisions that have not been made yet, would also have to surrender its charter. But that's about the only procedural thing that would need to happen. None of the other procedures to form these other structures would be necessary to form 2 traditional schools. And I think that has a lot to do with why you'll see the focus of the plan in the joint study session that we're going to put forward, and why the rankings on the next slide are the way that they are, is that the traditional model is simply the easiest and fastest model. And so I'd like to transition us to the next set of factors that we're considering in this discussion, in this presentation. And you'll see that first one there is implementation timeline.
Hey, Atoka?
Yes.
It's been mentioned a few times that perhaps, I think if I heard correctly, perhaps the only way or the easiest way to serve all kids in classroom this fall is through unification. I'm digesting that over the last 24 hours, as kind of news. So I don't want to run us over time, but I could use an elaboration on that and why no other option is really, I don't know if it's not feasible. It feels like between last night and tonight, it's being presented as that might be our only option. And I'm trying to understand why that's our only option.
Yeah, thank you so much for asking that. I don't want to frame it as our only option because I think that would be erroneous.
Yes.
And that's why you see these other options here still considered on this next slide. For the reasons that we just spent some time discussing, we didn't continue on with the independent option because we really didn't feel it was viable for many of the reasons that we just discussed. And
I'm sorry, I didn't mean traditional unification being our only option. I meant
Timing.
That working towards unification by this fall was perhaps the only way we could serve all the kids in classroom. I thought that's what I was hearing between last night and tonight. And
I think the qualifier on that is the word safely.
Okay.
And so we did get some new guidance yesterday, and we'll continue to discuss that as a unification task force. We haven't had a chance to discuss it yet, but I think it sort of comes down to everyone's personal belief and choice. But the guidance that we have had, and the guidance that remains at least outside of schools, is that social distancing of 6 feet is the most desirable and healthy option. And that at least through the summer, in summer programs and daycares, gatherings of 12 is the healthiest, safest option. And I think actually the only option permitted through the summer. The guidance we got yesterday about fall and reopening of schools relaxes some of those things. It says 6 feet where feasible. It says your classroom size, your average classroom size, but with no less than 4 feet of spacing, and masks, and sanitary cohorts that never cross over when they mix through the rest of school. Still no recess, still no cafeteria, still really pretty extreme sanitization around bathrooming and trying to line up cohorts with bathrooms and things of that nature. And so add a 12-to-1 configuration, which we do believe is the safest way to reopen school, and the way, frankly, that most parents are likely to feel comfortable returning their children to school. Because while we could, under the new guidance, open up, a classroom for 25 kids, I wonder how parents will feel about sending their kids to that setting. But just operating with the belief that the safest way to do this is at 12-to-1, we would need to use both facilities in order to open school for all students.
This may go beyond what you were intending tonight, but this has been such a big theme about timing. So I want to ask briefly. Last night I heard that for Bayside MLK, independently to open this fall, we would use every room we have except for one portable, if I remember right.
That's correct.
So that's the only space available in a unified option is one portable. Like how is that such a big factor?
I totally get your question. There's a couple different things there. If we look at the number of students across all grades, across both schools, we can actually use the classroom configurations a little bit differently than what is just used when Bayside MLK is there. And so that's the cleanest answer to your question.
I didn't get that question. I didn't get it. Explain it to me.
Well, what Josh said correctly is that understanding our reopening plan that was presented at the board meeting last night, we're going to use most of the classrooms
Yes.
at Bayside MLK. There's
Yeah.
only one free classroom. And so he was asking, it doesn't seem like the addition of one classroom is enough of a factor to suddenly allow all the children at Willow Creek to go to school. Right? Because what they don't have is enough classrooms at Willow Creek. But
Yeah, okay, I'm like, that's obvious.
adding one doesn't seem like enough. And so what I was attempting to explain was the idea that by uniting the schools and all of the students in each grade level, we can load the classroom space that we have at a 12-to-1 student-to-teacher ratio, and all of the kids can attend school.
Got it, thank you.
And that statement is based on a walk of the campuses and a collaborative calculation, right?
It is, and Willow Creek board member Marika Smith, who actually does this work all over the state, has a formula for loading. And interestingly enough, her highly vetted scientific formula came up with the same result as our little bit less formal assessment. But yes, it's been determined both ways in the Unification Task Force and by Marika Smith and Kurt through a different methodology. And I think I feel very confident in saying that both of us came to the same conclusion in this regard.
And I think when we were looking at what was needed, if we needed anything through this process, and if you're consolidating and or unifying and having two campuses, that I think what we would need is maybe one portable on the Willow Creek campus, if that, but also bathrooms. So you get those kind of nice, fancy, portable bathrooms so that the classes could have cohort only bathrooms. So you don't have to mix or time bathroom visits or clean in between every bathroom visit kind of thing.
You did talk about that, yeah. So I don't think it's the only option, Josh. And I think it might be the most preferable option. That's the way I've thought of it.
And that's the way the committee thought of it.
Right.
All members, and I don't want to speak for others, but that was my impression from our conversations around this. I'm
sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
Yeah, and just one thing, I did watch the first study session or listen to it for Willow Creek, and I know there was some concern about that as an option. So I had asked, do we still want to pursue it? And the answer was yes, because obviously a lot's going to go into a September plan if that's what we want to pursue, but everybody wants to pursue. So it's better to know sooner than later that that's the preference.
Well, I was feeling like it was being presented as the not only preferred, perhaps only viable option, given the comments I was hearing around the logistics with anything but traditional in being difficult, if not impossible to do by the fall. And so that's where I was coming from. So I think this discussion's been certainly helpful for me and maybe others who are listening or will watch later. So thank you.
Thank you for asking that. I think that was a really important question. Do you feel like you got enough of an answer?
I do.
Okay. Shall we transition to some of the other columns here, other than implementation timeline? I think we just discussed that one pretty roundly.
Yeah. And then facilities, I think the yellows for dependent charter and hybrid were mostly because the dependent charter would need certain facilities use agreements and potential fees, and right. I think that was why we put those yellow under facilities. because there's just some charter-esque type facilities agreements that would need to happen with a dependent charter. Did I get that right? You filled these in.
I think
Yeah.
so. That's my memory of our meetings. Yes.
And then
We
Go ahead.
didn't want to have to go through, well, it's fine. We're happy to go through it if that's the decision, but we viewed it as a little bit more complex to have to continue to go through facilities negotiations, or once the current settlement agreement expires, continued Prop 39 applications, or continued conversations over oversight fees, or pro rata shares, or things of that nature. And that's why those are yellow.
Yeah. And again, we, as Dr. Garcia mentioned earlier, while we were focused on a hybrid option, certainly all of those would be doable. But for our coding here, remember, it was easy and fiscally viable. So there's not these don't code really like a preference. It's just kind of qualitative for those two measures. So under staffing, let's see, traditional, I think the yellow for staffing was something that Dr. Garcia alluded to earlier, and it's checked because if we went to a dependent charter, as Dr. Garcia mentioned, our traditional school teachers for those grades that would convert to a dependent charter would need to vote for that conversion. And it's checkered because it's still, I think, unclear whether it would be just the current union members that would vote to convert, or is it all combined staff of a new K-8 group that would vote to convert to charter. And if they voted not to convert to charter, then I guess you would default to traditional. So there's a bit of an unknown, both in which groups would be voting, but also would they in fact vote for dependent charter? We can't assume which way the vote would go. Sure, we do polling and try and anticipate, whether that would actually happen, but that's why it's yellow, because it's kind of an unknown, and it's got a level of risk to it. But then we need to do a little more research, and that's why it's checkered.
I just was going to add, Caroline, thank you. That was very thorough. Also, why the traditional school is green. Right.
And we wouldn't have those issues.
It doesn't require a vote.
Right. So under budget, traditional is yellow because I think mostly because the union labor costs are higher. But we've done some initial modeling on what would the incremental cost be were we to convert every single one of Willow Creek staff to union. And as I mentioned, the base salaries wouldn't go up significantly if we dropped teachers into the step-in column of our current staffing configurations. It's primarily the increase in costs for health and welfare and pensions. And there was a lot of discussion about ensuring equity in pay scale. I think all of our committee members agreed that if we were to combine under one union, or under the union bargaining agreements, that we would ensure equity and parity with the step-in column with numbers of years service and schooling and units and all the qualifications that would drop you into that schedule. Right, Dr. Garcia? Did I get all that?
You did. I think the only other thing I would add to that is the reason the traditional budget isn't green. I think people might wonder, well, why isn't it green? The reason that we actually opted for the traditional budget to be yellow is because of the loss of revenue
Oh, right.
we get from out-of-district students under some of the charter configurations.
That's right. That's right. Thank you. Yeah, so I think it's twofold. The union increased costs, but also the loss of out-of-district revenue. But we would replace some of that with our school of choice, 25%. But it would be likely under the traditional model that while I would hope that we would retain all current out-of-district students and perhaps even siblings, that it may, if we get higher demand for in-district, that we may, through attrition, decrease our out-of-district enrollment over time. So that would become less of an impact over time, I think. The dependent charter is red, and Dr. Garcia mentioned this earlier. And hybrid could be orange, but we didn't have orange. But it's red dotted because we're not entirely sure about this, but there's concern that under an all charter district that we have the potential to lose our basic aid. And essentially the advice from council was Ed Code doesn't address this directly about if you have an all charter district, whether you retain your basic aid, your excess funding, and that you might need some advice from your legislative body to determine whether you'd retain the basic aid. And so we put that as red as being a really high risk if that wasn't to pan out, but also obviously it would be time consuming to try and get some definitive answer from whatever legislative body or entity or individuals that could give us an answer and say that this is for sure, guaranteed that you're going to keep your basic aid. So I'm curious, can I ask Tarina about your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I would say this would be, I would recommend that there would be a sort of formal description of what the group is pondering, and I can certainly help, but basically push it through to the Department of Ed and the Fiscal Services Division. They're the ones that are going to ultimately rule on this, as would the Department of Finance, I would imagine, because this is of the uniqueness of this. Mm-hmm. They'll end up running it through their legal, which will take a lot. I'm just saying the department doesn't move quickly on things that are somewhat ambiguous in code. So I would say that's where I would start. That would be my go-to.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and it's mostly because there's not, I think, at least to the attorney's knowledge, any other all charter districts that are basic aid.
Right,
and so the code is no precedent.
Right, and the code, wherever the code is not explicitly clear, it would take the department running it through their legal, and they may or may not opine on it, and then goes back to your point, Caroline, which is if you want the definitive resolution on this, you'd want to seek cleanup legislation to define it.
Right. Yep. And I think hybrid's not red because if we still had a traditional set of grades, that we'd retain basic aid, even if another set of grades was dependent charter. But that traditional portion of grades would essentially protect that basic aid funding. But what isn't easy to reflect here is that dependent charter and hybrid would also have some benefit in budgeting for out-of-district students. As we mentioned before, we would still get the 70% funding from students that come from LCFF districts.
And that's why the hybrid bullet is yellow.
Right. Yeah. And also, if it's an all charter district authorized by the state, we now get basic aid too for out-of-district students. So, but again, you balance that with the in-district enrollment problem with the charter side of it. And then we talked So is that clear? Any questions on budget, staffing? Okay. Curricular flexibility we touched on earlier when we were talking about how we came off of hybrid. And we just want to emphasize that there is curricular flexibility with all options. So it's not that one option has more than the other.
Yeah, thank you, Caroline. I want to just take a minute and
yeah, I'm not a curricular girl. You go ahead. Go for it.
Maybe expound upon that a little bit. You know, this has been a consistent theme. It's been a consistent part of the conversation. Where there's a concern that by going all traditional, we will lose curricular flexibility around project-based learning or around certain teaching pedagogies or certain curriculum. And, you know, why this is green in our particular traditional model is really due to our size and our nimbleness. That narrative may be true in large traditional school districts where there is a big district office and a significant amount of bureaucracy that is involved in making curricular decisions. That isn't the case in our district. Our teachers and our principal make curriculum decisions, and all of the red tape, everything that could get in the way of curricular flexibility are the people that are on video streaming right now. It's us. We're the red tape. It's the superintendent and the board of trustees. And I believe strongly that this group of people is committed to curricular flexibility. I know that I am. I believe strongly that teacher-created curriculum is the best curriculum. And usually when you hear the narrative around curricular flexibility, it's the lack of teacher ability to create curriculum that supports that narrative. I have a very different view of that. And in discussions on the task force and in discussions with members of the Willow Creek educational community, I have said that, and I will reiterate it, and I will double down on it when given the opportunity. I want to pay our teachers to make flexible curriculum. I believe it is the pathway towards a world-class school. I believe it is the best way to develop a curriculum, and that allows a curriculum to be developed. And it's not to say that we never use any packaged curriculum or purchased curriculum or state-adopted curriculum, but it's always the idea from me that an adopted curriculum is the floor. It is the minimal thing that we do. And curriculum created by our staff that is focused on the needs of our community, that is focused on the history of our community and the connection of those needs and that history to our wider county and state and country and world is really the ceiling of curriculum.
Yeah, and I think we have good examples of that with our community school and Jameer's model being used for that state assembly bill, right? Isn't it being used as an example?
It is.
Yeah. And so to me, that's an example of our creativity and flexibility in creating a program that's being held up as an ideal model for the state.
And that was created in a matter of weeks, months.
Yeah, because he's a Superman.
That's the truth. Yeah.
So then operations was kind of a catch-all. I think it was kind of how the day-to-day after school lunch program. What else in there?
Facilities, payroll, HR.
That's right. Yeah, and it's obviously, you know, looking at, we've all talked about this, and I think everybody recognizes this, that through a unified school, we'd eliminate redundancies, we'd eliminate, we'd taken advantage of economies of scale, through contracts and vendors and financial operations and so forth. So I think that's true of any of these models because they all signify unification. But dependent charter was yellow, but just I think because there was a little bit some complications, as we mentioned earlier, with Prop 39 agreements and what else? Deborah.
I don't remember why we made that yellow. Sorry. I'm trying to find the follow-up document.
I think one of the things around operations simply was we were thinking through some credentialing issues and we were thinking through also some of the compliance requirements still and the district will play that function in a dependent charter configuration, but as an all dependent charter district authorized by the county, but still governed by our school board, I think we're just concerned a little bit about the flexibility and communication between the board and the dependent charter.
Yeah, the dependent charter wouldn't have its own board though. It would still be governed by our board.
Yeah, no, but I meant just in terms of operations. We felt like it would be easier to have the traditional structure in place that the M&O offers or that the district office offers.
Okay. All right. So that's kind of the high level of 20-something meetings and where we came to. And again, as Dr. Garcia mentioned in the beginning, this is a chart that Deborah and Dr. Garcia and I developed off of our notes from looking at the pros and cons as a task force. It could be that when we bring this back to the group, there might be some changes in colors and other discussions to this, but this is kind of where we are at this point with this draft charts.
Good.
Anything else?
Great
Was there
job.
another slide or are we done?
Great job, Caroline.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. It was pretty thorough, Carolyn. After a gazillion meetings to remember all of that, and yeah, thanks.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Good.
You didn't plan on doing all the talking. It just started happening.
No, I'm
Dr. Garcia
glad.
set me loose.
Yeah, well, no, I'm glad that you did that because, yeah, it's like I lived the experience vicariously as you were going through it.
It's definitely a massive group effort. A massive effort.
Awesome.
So before we move on to our next item, I do want to just make sure that no other trustees are sitting with any questions or wonderings or desires of having any discussion. And I can really go back to the last screen. I just don't want to transition without checking with all of you first.
I have a couple of questions. I had asked earlier about other factors, and you, of course, did go through the second screen with additional factors. One of the things I think we've heard throughout this process, including from, I guess, a finance subcommittee or something, was kind of this narrative of how much more cost efficient Willow Creek currently is, or a independent charter, or maybe even a dependent charter might be. And I didn't see kind of how that's addressed in here.
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah.
I think that part of that analysis, part of that narrative is the fact that Willow Creek's not unionized today. And that's probably a big part of it. There's probably more. And I feel in our presentation, we've assumed the answer that any go forward structure will be unionized simply because that's likely the way a vote would go and a vote's required. But I think it's worth explicitly, observing that. And if I have it wrong, please let me know.
No, you have that exactly right. But also added to that is the potential loss of basic aid if we were an all independent or all charter district. So there was pluses and minuses. While yes, an independent charter non-union can be more efficient, it was the union's impact. It was potential loss of basic aid. And what else? You mentioned the third one, but I want to make sure I have those down. And then one of the advantages right now for a charter school is that they can hire non-credentialed specialists. But my understanding is that is ending in 2 years. And so anyone who currently is not credentialed would need to get a credential, or they would need to emergency credential or something like that. But so one of those advantages is not going to be, wouldn't be realized.
The other factor I didn't see explicitly addressed, the discussion of kind of an appointed versus an elected board. Maybe it's not big enough to kind of factor out on its own, or I don't know, but I've certainly been exposed to a lot of back and forth discussion on that, and seem to be absent from here.
Are you talking about the advantages and disadvantages?
Yeah.
Well, the appointed board, we can't have my understanding is we can't decide to just have an appointed board as a district, because as a public entity, we and responsible for public funds, that you would need to have an elected board by ed code in order to oversee those public funds. So if we were to go traditional or dependent charter, where the board would be the oversight, where you would have an oversight body, it would need to be an elected governing board. And my understanding is the appointed board would only arise from an independent charter. And while that may have its advantages, there's a lot of other disadvantages to that option that we talked about already. Does that answer your question? And Dr. Garcia, Trina, chime in if I'm wrong about the
you're absolutely
elected board.
You're spot on, and it really is about. I mean, this is at the heart of the issue. Taxation without representation, it runs in violation of that. You have to have, in order to be. It's an interesting nuance even with charter schools. The only way charter schools can receive property taxes, the operative word here is in lieu. So they have to get it through a taxing entity, which is the school district, and a school district can only be governed by an elected board.
Yep.
Yeah, I wasn't suggesting otherwise, but I think this is a part of the broader discussion. So I was just observing that, our heat map didn't address it explicitly. So I'm glad we're talking about it tonight.
And we can add that. And then just to add, some folks were interested in what if we appointed two members to our board. But I went through reading through ed code, and in order to add 2 board members to our board, the first step is you would have to have it approved by the county and the county committee. And then you would need a petition, and then it would need to go to the voters to add 2 positions. And then once if the voters approved the 2 additional board member positions, the board would then appoint those 2 positions. But to do an appointment, there's a whole nother process by ed code where you have to advertise the openings, accept applications, review the applications, and pick the most qualified individuals. And I would say if there was a bad perception of who you picked and that there was bias, I would assume there's some FCP, what's the acronym? Fair Political Practices Act, and some danger there under the Fair Political Practices Act if you didn't seem to have a transparent, open, and unbiased process.
And I would add, Caroline, you've got everything exactly right. The appointment is only for a short duration.
Until there's an election.
When the next election cycle comes up, they would be elected.
Yeah. My understanding, though, is if you added 2 board seats, you would immediately start the appointment process, and that would be far enough away from the next election that you would go through the appointment process. So it's not as simple as we would appoint 2 board members of our choosing. So it's a long, drawn out, complicated process. Again, if that's the desire of the community and that's the way we'd want to go, we'd certainly explore it. But I think the group decided that it was there was a lot more to it than initially understood.
And in the end, no guarantees.
Right, in the end, no guarantees. Right.
The last dimension I can think of off the top of my head that I wasn't in the heat map, but I think was touched on is, I think you touched on the sentiment between the 2 task force or committees on unification, that the attraction to charter was less about charter and more about program flexibility.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't see any measure of kind of community or family sentiment to any of these options, or any kind of analysis of if that sentiment is negative, potential flight. Did that come up in any of the discussions?
I think we're aware that this will, and I think if you'll see next on the timeline, that I think we'd probably go through this same process with the community and with the work groups. So I think still no option is being ruled out. But I think our immediate input was from listening to the study session from the Willow Creek board. But I think you're right. We would, our next step is to also get more community input on options and timing and everything else. Certainly.
Especially from your families, or from all the families. Yeah. Really, that's the bottom line. It's the families.
Right. Absolutely.
And
right.
And I don't know. I'm just hearing in the community, some great momentum on the discussions that are happening, and just this whole idea of a one school community. I'm hearing more positive things than I am not hearing things like, oh well, if that happens I'm going to leave the district, or what about the people that's going to leave the district? I don't know, maybe it's this time right now, this time that we're in right now, maybe that's driving some of that some of those concerns. But
yeah,
I think a survey.
To that end, we have about 1 minute left on this agenda, and Trustee Barrow, if you're okay, can I move us to the final item?
Good luck in 1 minute.
We can read. We can do it
really
in 29.
It was actually a wonderful segue, really, because the next item is really about looking forward, and it's about continuing to get that feedback from the community that you've addressed, and really that's the plan. We'll have another unification task force meeting on Monday, where we'll get to reflect as a task force on the feedback from tonight from this group. We will have a joint board study session the following week, and then we'll turn it over to the work groups and get their feedback and invite our staff to give feedback in the first 2 weeks of July. Shoot for a final unification town hall in the third week of July. And then, of course, obviously, given the feedback of that process, if that leads us to a final plan, then a potential ratification by the end of July. But know that we are very committed to getting ongoing community feedback from all of the groups here involved. And we may need more than one joint board study session, but we want to determine that as the process goes on, and see how it goes week after next. Does anybody have any questions about this?
I think it's pretty forward. Okay, the synthesized feedback and update, that's you. Where the families coming in? Did I miss that part?
In the town halls.
And I think the work groups too can work on surveys.
Yeah.
And
Are there surveys going out to families at large? And what about families that don't have children in the district? Are you reaching out to them?
Yes, we have surveyed those groups, and we can certainly craft another survey. If there's, two or three questions that really come up that we feel like we need to get a second, a third, a fifth, a eighth opinion on. We definitely want to fully engage the community in this process, and get the, you all have heard me say this in other settings, but I have committed to doing what's called an academic research member checking. And we are committed to member checking. So we would not want to move forward with any plan for ratification before this board or the Willow Creek board without asking a few more times, hey, are we getting it right? We think this is what we heard. And given all the information we have, we believe this is the best option. Are we getting it right? And I think everybody on the Unification Task Force is really committed to doing that. And I know all of you as trustees are as well.
So I have a question about kind of the go forward process. We just spent the better part of 2 hours talking about just structural options. And, according to the heat map, the traditional options clearly bubbling as a recommendation. But we haven't talked about kind of approach to implementation. I've heard things like, well, maybe we should start with just certain grades, ease into this, ease into that. There's a lot of complexity beyond structure. When either as a board in a study session or as we engage the community, how do we get beyond just the structure topic?
Yeah, thank you for asking that, Josh. The intent of the Unification Task Force is to get down in those weeds, if you will, with both boards together at the joint study session. We felt like that would be the most productive strategy, so that we're talking as a group and working through those details together and attempting to build consensus. Remember, that is going to be a study session, so we won't be taking any action, but we can certainly build consensus around ideas. And that is our plan. We have built a pretty strong consensus as a Unification Task Force. And so we have set the agenda up, which should come out soon once we confirm the meeting. And I think we have it confirmed. I apologize, it's not quite on people's calendars yet, but I'll make sure it happens on Monday. There's some things that we agree strongly on as a Unification Task Force. And then there's some things that we agree less strongly on as a Unification Task Force. And they're all in those details that you just mentioned. And so that's the discussion we wanted to really have with the joint board, provided that both boards are going with some of the base recommendations and guidelines that we feel strongly about as Unification Task Force.
Thank you.
yeah, I think, that's a great questions, Josh. And we struggled with we wanted to start setting out implementation, but that wasn't really our goal and our charge. Our charge as a task force was mostly to come up with, here are all the options, here's the pros and cons. And once you decide on your kind of pick list from the options, then I think the implementation and the timing kind of flows from that.
That was my sense of what we're charged to do, and implementation is another level.
Yep. Implementation, that's, buy-in, community meetings, board meetings, it's a whole nother level of involvement.
And,
Teacher.
Yeah, that's where I was going to go. Thank you, Deborah. I really think that once we agree on the parameters and the outlines, this is where teachers and school site staff and administrators and everyone gets involved once we have direction from both boards to figure out all the details and of course bring them back. But we want teachers designing curriculum. That's where they're professionals. We want our director of M&O making collaborative decisions around what the best way is to keep facilities maintained at the highest level.
Transportation work group working on, staggered start times and carpooling options and all that kind of stuff.
Don't get me wrong. I wasn't suggesting we do all that. I was just figuring out when we talk through it with ourselves and with the community.
You're the implementation committee. We just nominated you.
That one I'll serve on. That one I'll serve on.
Committee soon.
Sorry, are you ready to work out the stable sanitary cohort carpool tree?
Listen, folks, I got a fish fry to get to. So,
all right.
Are we close to the end of this, or?
As long as nobody has any other questions, we will, I think, need a motion to adjourn. But we are at 4.01, adjourning the meeting. And I just want to thank everybody for their engagement and their time and their energy. And we're really looking forward to the study session with the Willow Creek Board.
Yes, and not to be flippant at all. Laughter is good for the heart. It happens to be Juneteenth, June the 19th. We've been celebrating this as Black folks for over 100 and some odd years in recognition of Freedom Day. And so in that spirit, I'm just, I just want to say that
I'll move we adjourn.
I appreciate all the work that has gone into what you guys have done. I appreciate all the volunteers in the community, folks that have come to all those numerous meetings and the task force and all the rest. And thank you so much. I truly appreciate it. So unless Josh or Bonnie has something to add.
No, I moved and Josh seconded.
We have moved in second, all in favor.
Aye.
Aye. We're going to end this board meeting at 7:08.
All right. Thanks, everybody, especially after last night.
Yeah, really.